Let us begin with a misconception that sits at the heart of how most people understand the ending of a narcissistic relationship. When the narcissist moves on, when the new person appears, when the relationship that you were told was over suddenly seems to have been replaced with remarkable speed and remarkable ease, when everything you were told about their need for space and their exhaustion with the relationship evaporates in the apparent warmth of a new connection. The natural human interpretation is that a transition has occurred, that something ended and something else began, that you have been replaced, which is painful enough, but that the replacement at least represents a clean break, a new chapter, a different story with a different person that has, for better or worse, nothing to do with you anymore. That interpretation is understandable. It is also almost entirely incorrect, because what the narcissist experiences as the ending of a relationship is not what you or I would recognize as an ending. It does not involve the internal psychological work that genuine endings require, the processing of grief, the honest accounting of what went wrong, the integration of the experience into a developing self-understanding that might, over time, produce something different in the next relationship. None of that happens. Not because they are choosing to avoid it, though avoidance is certainly present, but because the psychological structure that would make that kind of processing possible, the capacity for genuine self-reflection, for holding the self accountable without the accountability becoming an existential threat, for tolerating the discomfort of being in between one attachment and the next, that structure was never fully built. And so what looks like an ending is actually a redistribution. Otto Kernberg, whose clinical work on narcissistic and borderline personality organization remains foundational to how we understand these dynamics, described the narcissist's relational world as one fundamentally organized around the management of self-esteem through external sources, not the building of self-esteem through internal development, through the gradual, effortful, often painful work of becoming someone whose sense of worth is generated from within rather than extracted from without, but the perpetual management of it through an ongoing supply of admiration, attention, validation, and emotional response from the people in their relational landscape. And supply in this framework is not a single relationship. It is a portfolio. The new person, the one whose appearance seemed to signal your replacement, is receiving the idealization, the full performance, the version of the narcissist that you yourself encountered at the beginning, that felt so compelling and so specific and so precisely calibrated to who you were that it seemed impossible to have been manufactured. They are receiving the intensity, the attunement, the sense of being uniquely understood by someone of unusual depth and perception. And they are in the private experience of their own developing attachment, falling in the way that you once fell, with the same trust, the same hope, the same growing investment in something that feels, from the inside, entirely singular, but you have not disappeared from the ecosystem. They have been repositioned within it. The backup, whether it is you specifically or someone else maintained in careful reserve, receives a different kind of contact, less intense, more irregular, calibrated not to ignite, but to sustain. A message that arrives just frequently enough to keep the thread alive. A moment of warmth deployed with sufficient timing to prevent the final withdrawal of availability, just enough to maintain the implicit understanding that the door, from your side, remains open. That if the current arrangement encounters difficulty, and the narcissist, whose pattern always eventually produces difficulty, knows at some level that there is somewhere to redirect. This is not a conscious conspiracy. I want to be clear about that, because attributing full strategic awareness to this architecture gives it a coherence it does not actually possess. It is, more accurately, the behavioral expression of a nervous system that has never developed the capacity to tolerate the vulnerability of having only one source of emotional regulation, to depending entirely on a single relationship for the management of a self-esteem that cannot manage itself. Gabor Maté speaks about how addictive behavior and the narcissistic relationship to supply has genuine structural parallels with addiction. Is never really about the substance. It is about the relief the substance provides from an internal state that feels otherwise unendurable. The narcissist is not maintaining multiple supply sources because they are greedy, though the effect is certainly harmful enough to warrant that word. They are maintaining them because the internal experience of being without supply, of having no one available to reflect back the image the grandiose self requires in order to function, is for their psychological organization genuinely intolerable. The redistribution, in other words, is not a choice in the way that word is ordinarily understood. It is a compulsion dressed in the appearance of agency, the psychological imperative that the conscious mind has never been required to examine, because it has never been required to stop. And the tragedy for the new supply, for the backup, and in its own way, for the backup, and in its own way, for the narcissists themselves, is that a person who cannot be alone cannot actually be with anyone. They can only be managed. And management, however skillfully executed, is not the same thing as love. It never was. And it never will be. Here is the expanded segment for key point 2. I want to speak directly to the new supply for a moment. Not with condescension, material, not with the slightly superior positioning of someone who has already been through what they are currently inside of and therefore believes they can see it more clearly from the outside. That positioning, however tempting, is neither accurate nor kind. Because the person who is currently in the idealization phase of a narcissistic relationship is not there because they are less perceptive, less intelligent, or less psychologically sophisticated than the person who came before them. They are there because the performance they are receiving is genuinely compelling, because it was designed through decades of unconscious refinement to be genuinely compelling, and because the human need for the kind of connection that performance simulates is not a weakness. It is one of the most fundamental and most legitimate needs in the entire architecture of human experience. But there is something the new supply deserves to know, something that, if they could access it clearly, would recontextualize everything they are currently experiencing in a way that nothing else quite can. What is happening to them has happened before. Not in the vague general sense that all relationships contain patterns and all people bring their history into their present connections. In the specific sense, the precise sense, the sense that the particular quality of attention they are currently receiving, that remarkable, almost uncanny attunement that seems to understand them more completely than they have ever been understood, that appears to see directly into the specific contours of who they are and reflected back with such fidelity that the experience borders on the miraculous. That attention has been directed with the same specificity and the same apparent depth at someone else, in this same way, with these same gestures, perhaps with some of these same words. This is not a speculation. This is what the psychology of narcissistic idealization actually produces. Hervey Cleckley, two's foundational clinical observations on personality organization anticipated much of what contemporary research has confirmed, noted that the most striking feature of the narcissistically organized individual's relational behavior is not its cruelty. The cruelty comes later and is well documented, but its reproducibility. The idealization is not spontaneous. It is not the overflow of a genuine feeling that happened to find this particular person as its object. It is a relational technology. As sophisticated as a relational technology. A sophisticated, interjecting stick of empath, largely unconscious, extraordinarily well-practiced set of behaviors that the narcissist deploys not because they have assessed this specific person and determined that they are uniquely worthy of this quality of attention, but because idealization is what the supply acquisition phase of their relational cycle requires. The new supply is not receiving a love story. They are receiving an audition. Toolist dimension of this, the dimension that makes it so genuinely difficult to hold clearly, even for people who have encountered this pattern before, is that the performance contains real elements. The attunement, however, ultimately instrumental, requires genuine attention. The mirroring, however strategically deployed, requires real perception of who the person actually is. The narcissist cannot produce a convincing idealization of someone they have not actually, in some significant sense, seen. And being seen, however the seeing is subsequently used, produces a real experience of recognition in the person being seen. This is what makes the later discovery so specifically devastating. Not just that it was not what it appeared to be, but that it was not entirely not what it appeared to be. That somewhere inside the performance, there was genuine perception. Genuine attention, genuine if ultimately instrumental, interest in the specific person they were pursuing. And that genuine element makes the boundary between what was real and what was performance impossible to draw with the clean lines that full recovery would prefer. Milan Kundera wrote about what he called the unbearable lightness of being, the human condition of living inside experiences whose meaning is always, to some degree, retrospectively assigned. We do not know what something is while we are inside it. We construct the meaning afterward from the outside, with the information that the inside did not yet have. The new supply is inside the experience. The meaning has not yet been retrospectively assigned, and the experience from the inside is genuinely compelling, because it was designed by a psychology that has spent a lifetime learning exactly how to make it so. Gabor Maté speaks about how the earliest wounds, the unmet needs for genuine attunement, for being truly seen and truly held in the full complexity of who we are, create in us a particular vulnerability to anything that resembles their fulfillment. The narcissist's idealization is not random. It targets, with extraordinary precision, the specific quality of seeing that the person most needed and most rarely received. It finds the wound and offers itself as the cure, and the relief of that, the profound, neurologically real relief of feeling finally completely understood, is not an illusion, even if its source is. But the clock is already running. The pattern that preceded this idealized act, aion, and preceded the one before it, and the one before that is already in motion beneath the surface of the performance. The devaluation is not a possibility contingent on how well the new supply manages the relationship or how adequately they meet the narcissist's needs. It is a structural inevitability written into the cycle itself, the same script, the same arc, the same destination, because the narcissist did not find a new love when they found a new supply. They found a new audience for an old performance. And every performance, however compelling in its opening act, eventually reaches the scene that the person in the front row does not yet know is coming, but the one who wrote it has always known was there. I want to spend some time with the person in reserve. Not the new supply. Their experience, however painful it will eventually become, contains at least the dignity of having been chosen, of having been pursued, of having been, however temporarily and however manipulatively, the object of genuine effort and attention. Their idealization, however manufactured, was at least directed at them specifically, at something in them that the narcissist identified and mirrored and temporarily organized themselves around. The backup's experience is different, and in certain ways it is more quietly devastating, because the backup was not chosen in the way the new supply was chosen. They were retained. The distinction between being chosen and being retained is one of the most psychologically significant distinctions available to us in understanding what the narcissist's relational architecture actually communicates about how different people are valued within it. To be chosen is to be seen as the primary destination. To be retained is to be seen as a contingency, and contingencies, by their very definition, are not valued for what they are. They are valued for what they are. They are valued for what they provide in the event that the primary arrangement fails. The backup exists not because the narcissist has looked at them clearly in the full light of who they actually are and decided that this person is someone they genuinely want to be close to. They exist because the narcissist has looked at them and identified something more specific and more utilitarian: availability, emotional accessibility, the door that can be reopened with a relatively modest investment of attention and warmth because it was never fully allowed to close. This is what makes the backup situation so particularly complex to examine with honesty, because the backup, in most cases, knows something is wrong, feels it, in the way that the body always feels the truth that the mind is still negotiating with. They know that the contact is irregular. They know that the warmth arrives in patterns that do not quite match the patterns of genuine, freely given affection. They know that there is something managed about the attention they receive, something calibrated, something that seems to arrive precisely when they are about to stop being available, and then recede again once their availability is resecured. They know it, and they stay anyway. And I want to resist the temptation, which is significant, and which I think much of the popular discourse around these dynamics fails to resist, to judge that staying, to diagnose it as simple codependency, or low self-worth, or the straightforward failure of boundaries. Because the staying is almost always more psychologically complex than any of those explanations fully captures. Mary Ainsworth's landmark studies on attachment, which gave us the foundational categories of secure, anxious, and avoidant attachment, documented something she called the anxious ambivalent pattern. An attachment style characterized by a hyperactivated attachment system, an N10, preoccupation with the availability of the attachment figure, and a paradoxical tendency to remain most intensely attached to precisely those figures who are least consistently available. The intermittent reinforcement that the narcissist provides, the irregular warmth, the unpredictable contact, the variable reward schedule, that behavioral psychology has long identified as the most resistant to extinction, does not merely keep the backup available. It actively deepens the attachment. It creates, through the very inconsistency of its delivery, a preoccupation and a longing that consistent affection would never have produced. The backup is not staying because they cannot see clearly. They are staying because the neurochemistry of intermittent attachment has produced in them a state that is, in its functional characteristics, indistinguishable from profound emotional investment. The hope that is generated by the occasional warmth is not rational, but it is not irrational either. It is biological. It is the attachment system responding exactly as it was designed to respond to the specific stimulus of unpredictable availability from a figure it has come to treat as significant. The narcissist, whether consciously or through the deep behavioral intelligence of a lifetime spent managing people, understands this. Not in theoretical terms. They have not read Ainsworth, and they could not diagram the neurochemistry of intermittent reinforcement, but in the practical, embodied, experientially acquired knowledge of someone who has learned, across decades of relational navigation, precisely how little is required to maintain the availability of someone who has been conditioned to interpret scarcity as significance. Sish, at the right moment, a reference to a shared memory, deployed with just enough specificity to feel genuine. A moment of apparent vulnerability, the controlled disclosure of difficulty that signals need without actually requesting the kind of sustained support that genuine need would require. These are not elaborate strategies. They are habits. Relational reflexes develop so early and practiced so thoroughly that they operate almost automatically, below the level of deliberate choice. Gabor Maté speaks about how the most painful human experiences are almost never the result of malice in the ordinary sense of that word. They are the result of unconscious patterns, operating with mechanical consistency, producing damage that the person generating it is only partially aware of, and even less capable of interrupting without a level of self-examination that the pattern itself is designed to prevent. The backup is being harmed not by a person who looked at them clearly and decided they were worth harming. They are being harmed by a pattern that has never been required to look at anyone clearly at all. And the most devastating thing about being kept in reserve is not that you were not chosen. It is that you are considered valuable enough to maintain, but never quite significant enough to fully pursue. And no human being, in the full dignity of what they are and what they deserve, should ever be someone else's contingency plan. Here is the expanded segment for Key Point 48U. There is something that the narcissist understands about their own pattern that they will almost never directly acknowledge, not to the people in their life, not to the therapist they occasionally and briefly engage with before the process becomes too threatening to continue. Barely, if ever, to themselves in the unguarded moments when the performance is not required and the truth of their own history has the space to surface. They know it does not last. Not as an abstract psychological insight, not as the kind of self-awareness that might motivate genuine change, but as a felt experiential knowledge accumulated across enough repetitions of the same cycle that some part of their psychology, the part that observes rather than performs, the part that records rather than narrates, has registered the pattern with something approaching certainty. The idealization ends. The devaluation follows. The relationship that felt, at its beginning, like the one that would finally be different, finally be enough, finally provide the sustained supply that the internal void requires, that relationship always, eventually produces the same wreckage, and they begin again. This cyclical quality of narcissistic relational behavior is not accidental. It is not the product of bad luck or poor partner selection or the kinds of circumstantial explanations the narcissist's revisionist narrative tends to prefer. It is structural. It is written into the architecture of how narcissistic psychology relates to intimacy itself. Understanding why requires us to examine what actually happens in the narcissist's internal experience as a relationship progresses beyond the idealization phase. Heinz Kohut's concept of the self-object is essential here. Kohut described how the developing self requires specific kinds of mirroring from its early environment, consistent, attuned, genuinely responsive reflection of its worth, its competence, its essential lovability. In order to build the internal structures that will eventually allow it to generate those experiences from within rather than requiring them perpetually from without. When that early mirroring is inadequate, when the environment fails to provide the consistent attunement the developing self requires, the internal structures do not fully form. And the adult that emerges from that developmental environment continues to require from external relationships what was never sufficiently internalized, continues to need the self-object, the person who functions as a mirror, a source of validation, a regulator of self-esteem in the way that a younger developmental stage requires it. The specific, structurally inevitable problem that produces the cycle is that no adult relationship can sustainably provide what an early developmental environment failed to build, not because the people involved are inadequate, but because the need itself, at the depth and the urgency at which it operates in narcissistic psychology, exceeds what any human being can consistently supply. The new supply, however devoted, however attuned, however genuinely invested in the relationship, will eventually, inevitably, not through any failure of their own, fail to provide the perfect, uninterrupted, unconditional mirroring that the unmet developmental need requires. And when that failure occurs, when the new supply has a bad day and is insufficiently attentive, when they have needs of their own that compete briefly with the narcissist's requirement for centrality, when they offer a perspective or a gentle challenge that the grandiose self experiences as criticism, the idealization collapses, not gradually, not through a process of negotiation and adjustment that a more securely attached psychology would navigate, but suddenly and with a completeness that is, to the person experiencing it, genuinely disorienting. The person who was, yesterday, idealized as uniquely wonderful becomes, today, experienced as profoundly disappointing. The split is not performed. It is the psychological mechanism of idealization, simply revealing its own inherent fragility, its dependence on a perfection that no human being can maintain. James Masterson, whose clinical work on the disorders of the self remains among the most practically illuminating in the field, described this transition from idealization to devaluation as the moment the real self of the other person becomes visible. The idealization was always at its foundation a projection. The narcissist was not seeing the new supply as they actually were. They were seeing the reflection of their own need, a surface smooth enough and available enough to hold the image the grandiose self required. The moment the actual person beneath that surface becomes visible, with their own complexity, their own needs, their own irreducible humanity that refuses to be permanently reducible humanity that refuses to mirror, the projection collapses. Tunison. The devaluation is, in a very precise psychological sense, the narcissist's response to the disappointment of encountering a real person where a perfect reflection used to be. Gabor Maté speaks about how the deepest human longing, the longing for genuine connection, for being truly known and truly accepted, is something that the narcissistic relational pattern perpetually seeks and perpetually destroys. Not because the longing is not real, but because the mechanisms deployed to address it are fundamentally incompatible with the conditions genuine connection requires. Genuine connection requires seeing the other person clearly. The narcissist's relational architecture requires using the other person as a mirror, and mirrors by definition can only show you yourself. The wreckage, then, is not an accident. It is not bad luck. It is not the result of choosing the wrong person, though the narcissist's revisionist narrative will always locate the failure there. It is the predictable, structurally determined outcome of a psychology attempting to meet a genuine human need through mechanisms that guarantee, by their very nature, that the need will never actually be met. The pattern always produces the same destination, because the pattern was never a path toward connection. It was a path that circled endlessly around the wound, mistaking the circling for progress, mistaking the next idealization for arrival, and leaving, in every direction it traveled, the same wreckage it was always going to leave the moment it encountered the irreducible humanity of a real person who refused to remain only a mirror. There is a moment that those who have lived inside narcissistic dynamics, whether as the new supply, the backup, or any of the other positions within the ecosystem we have been examining, describe with a striking consistency of language. It does not matter how different their specific circumstances were. It does not matter whether the discovery happened through a text message seen by accident, through a conversation with someone who knew more than they were supposed to know, through the particular quality of a silence that suddenly contained too much information, tore through the direct, unmediated collision of two people who had been carefully kept apart, finally finding themselves in the same room with the same questions. The description is almost always the same. Everything clicked into place. Not gradually, not through a process of careful reasoning that built toward a conclusion, but suddenly, with the specific, irreversible quality of a perception that once formed cannot be unformed. The way a hidden image in a puzzle once seen cannot be unseen, as though the truth had been fully assembled and waiting in the peripheral vision of their understanding for longer than they realized, requiring only this specific moment of contact, this collision of two separate experiences of the same person, to move from the periphery into the undeniable center. And in that moment, the narcissist's entire constructed reality collapses. I want to examine why this particular moment, the moment the two supplies find each other, is so specifically and so completely devastating to the narcissist's psychological architecture in a way that other forms of exposure are not. Because it is not simply that they are caught. People with narcissistic patterns are caught in smaller ways, with some regularity, and the system has well-developed mechanisms for managing those moments. Denial, the reframing, the conversion of the evidence into proof of the other person's instability or jealousy or fundamental unreliability as a witness to their own experience. These mechanisms are practiced, efficient, and often remarkably effective. What makes this moment different is that it removes the condition those mechanisms require in order to function. Those mechanisms work on individuals. They work on one person at a time in isolation, dependent on the narcissist's ability to control the informational environment, to be the primary narrator of their own story, to each person separately, to ensure that the version of events delivered to the new supply never quite meets the version of events experienced by the backup, to maintain the carefully managed separateness that allows contradictory realities to coexist without collision. Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist and systems theorist whose work on communication and relational dynamics remains remarkably prescient, described what he called the double bind, the impossible psychological position created when contradictory messages are delivered within a relationship that the recipient cannot easily leave. The narcissist's management of multiple supply sources is, in a certain sense, the inverse of the double bind. It is not one person receiving contradictory messages. It is multiple people receiving contradictory versions of the same reality, each version internally consistent enough, each person sufficiently isolated from the others that the contradictions never quite have the opportunity to confront each other directly, until they do. And when two people who have been living inside separately managed versions of the same person's reality finally compare those versions, when the specific details that were supposed to remain compartmentalized are laid side by side and the architecture of the deception becomes visible in its entirety, something happens that the narcissist management system has no protocol for addressing. Because the problem is no longer a single person's perception that can be reframed or destabilized or redirected. The problem is the convergence of two independent witnesses to the same truth, each one capable of corroborating what the other experienced, each one's account making the other's more credible and more complete. This is what the narcissist cannot survive reputationally or psychologically. Not the exposure itself. Exposure in isolation can be managed. But the collaboration, the solidarity, the specific devastating credibility that two people's independent accounts acquire when they discover in the comparing of notes that what each of them had been told was unique to them was, in fact, universal. That the special, singular, irreplaceable connection they each believed they had was reproduced with such fidelity in the other relationship that the specific phrases, the specific gestures, the specific moments of apparent depth and vulnerability are recognizable across both accounts. Gabor Maté speaks about how the truth in human relationships has a particular quality of resonance, a felt sense of recognition that does not require argument or evidence to produce conviction. Two people who have been harmed by the same pattern sit together and begin to speak. When the recognition moves between them, not as accusation, but as the quiet, neutral, deeply relieving experience of being finally, fully, accurately witnessed. So, ding is released in both of them that no individual confrontation with the narcissist could ever have produced. They are no longer alone in their perception, and the narcissist, whose power was always entirely dependent on keeping them alone in their perception, is no longer able to make either of them doubt what they know. The architecture does not crack under this pressure. It does not develop fissures that can be repaired with sufficient management and sufficient time. It simply, completely, and irreversibly falls. Because a story that requires two people to never speak to each other in order to remain coherent was never a story. It was a prison. In the moment the two prisoners compared notes, the walls came down for both of them, and the warden was left standing alone in the rubble of everything they built to keep them apart. Here is the expanded segment for key point 6. There is a specific quality to the grief that follows the discovery we examined in the previous point. The moment when the two supplies compared notes and the architecture collapsed and the truth became, for everyone involved, undeniable. That grief is real, and it deserves to be examined with the full seriousness it warrants. Because it is not the ordinary grief of a relationship ending. It is something more complex and more disorienting than that. Something that does not quite fit the emotional categories we normally reach for when we try to process the loss of someone who mattered to us. It is the grief of discovering that the uniqueness was a product. Let me be precise about what I mean by that. Because the word uniqueness is doing significant work in that sentence, and unpacking it carefully is essential to understanding why this particular grief lands the way it does. When we enter a relationship that feels genuinely significant, both the new supply and the backup entered this relationship believing it to be genuinely significant, because the experience of being idealized by a narcissist is from the inside one of the most compelling experiences of apparent significance available. We bring with us an assumption so fundamental that we rarely examine it consciously. The assumption that what is being offered to us is specific to us. That the attunement we are experiencing is a response to who we actually are. The depth of connection we feel is a function of something real and mutual and irreducibly particular to the two people involved. This assumption is not naive, so it is not a failure of sophistication or self-awareness. It is the normal, healthy, entirely reasonable premise on which human beings build genuine attachment. We attach to specific people. We invest in specific relationships. We trust that the quality of attention being directed at us is a response to the specific, unrepeatable configuration of who we are, our history, our depth, our particular way of moving through the world. Technology that would produce the same quality of apparent attunement directed at almost anyone who fulfilled the basic criteria of availability and emotional accessibility. The discovery that disrupts this assumption, the discovery that the words were the same, the gestures were the same, the specific moments of apparent depth and vulnerability were reproduced with a fidelity that makes individual authorship impossible, does not merely hurt. It restructures. It reaches back into the history of the relationship and retroactively recontextualizes every moment that felt most significant, every conversation that seemed to reveal something true, every instance of apparent understanding that produced the particular relief of being genuinely known. Marcel Mauss, the French sociologist whose work on the gift and its social function remains foundational in anthropology, argued that the value of a gift is inseparable from its singularity, from the fact that it was chosen or created specifically for its recipient, that it carries within it the evidence of particular attention and particular care. A gift that is mass-produced, however objectively valuable, loses something essential in the losing of its singularity. It can no longer function as an expression of specific regard because specific regard is precisely what its reproducibility denies. The narcissist's idealization is a mass-produced gift, and the discovery of its production process, the moment both supplies realize, in the comparing of their experiences, that what they each received was not crafted specifically for them, but replicated from a template that preceded both of them and will survive both of them, strips the gift of the only quality that made it feel irreplaceable. This is what both people are grieving simultaneously, not just the relationship, not just the person, and we have already established, across this entire conversation, the complexity of grieving someone who was never quite fully the person they performed. They are grieving the uniqueness itself, the particular, irreducible significance of having been this person's person, of having occupied a position in their life that no one else occupied in quite the same way. Because that uniqueness turns out to have been not a truth about who they were to this person, but a feature of a performance that did not require their uniqueness at all. And here is what makes this grief so particularly resistant to the ordinary processes of emotional resolution. Because grief, in its healthy expression, requires a clear object, a specific loss, a defined before and after. Specific loss, a defined before and after. But the loss being processed here is not simply the loss of a relationship. It is the loss of a version of the relationship, a version that now must be understood to have never quite existed in the form it was experienced. And grieving something that simultaneously happened and did not happen, that was simultaneously real in its emotional impact and constructed in its essential nature, requires a psychological flexibility and a tolerance for ambiguity that most grief frameworks were not designed to accommodate. Gabor Maté speaks about how the most complex grief is always the grief for what never was rather than for what was lost. The grief for the childhood that should have been. The grief for the parent who was present but not truly there. The grief for the version of a relationship that existed in the hoping rather than in the having. Both supplies, in the aftermath of this discovery, are grieving not just what ended, but what they now understand was never quite what it appeared to be. And that grief, taste, specific, fully felt, is the beginning of something the narcissist was never able to offer them. Reality. Shared, verifiable, unmanaged reality. The bedrock on which genuine connection, whenever they are ready to build it, will actually be possible. Because what they lost in the losing of the uniqueness was never truly theirs to begin with. And what they gained in the grief of discovering that, the clarity, the solidarity, the unmanipulated ground of their own perception is something no performance, however compelling, could ever have given them. There is a profound irony at the center of the narcissistic relational project, and I want to name it clearly, because it is the irony that this entire speech has been building toward, the one that makes the collapse we have been examining not merely a consequence, but something closer to an inevitability written into the architecture from the very beginning. The narcissist's entire relational life is organized around one primary objective, not pleasure, genuine connection, not even, in the ordinary sense, power, though power is certainly present as a mechanism. The primary objective, the one that drives the maintenance of multiple supply sources, the careful management of information, the strategic deployment of warmth and withdrawal, the exhausting perpetual performance of a self that does not quite exist, is the prevention of a single, specific experience. The experience of being entirely without admiration, without validation, without the external reflection that the grandiose self requires in order to feel real, without the emotional regulation that comes from having someone available, always someone available, to absorb the anxiety, confirm the self-image, and provide the relational scaffolding that an internally unstable psychology cannot provide for itself. The entire architecture, the new supply, the backup, the extended ecosystem of admirers and secondary sources maintained at various distances is not an expression of abundance. It is a defense against a void. And here is the irony that makes the collapse so complete, so final, and so precisely fitted to the crime of its own construction. The architecture that was designed to guarantee the permanent impossibility of that void produces, at the moment of its failure, exactly and only that void, with a thoroughness that no ordinary relational ending could replicate. Because ordinary relational endings, the endings that occur between people whose psychology permitted them to invest in one relationship at a time, to be honest about their needs and their commitments, to build connection through genuine vulnerability rather than managed performance. Those endings are painful, but they are survivable in a way that preserves something. They leave, usually, at least a partial social world intact. Some friendships that were genuinely mutual. Some connections that existed independently of the relationship's constructed ecosystem. The narcissist's ending leaves something different. Seneca, writing with a particular clarity that comes from having observed human nature with both philosophical rigor and personal intimacy, observed that no one can be genuinely happy who depends entirely on external circumstances for their contentment, that the only stable foundation for a life is the internal one, the cultivation of a self that can remain coherent and grounded regardless of what the external world provides or withdraws. It is perhaps the oldest wisdom in the Western philosophical tradition. It is the wisdom that the narcissistic psychology, in its developmental foreclosure of genuine interiority, was never able to receive. The loss of both supplies simultaneously is not merely the loss of two relationships. It is the loss of the entire regulatory system. The new supply withdraws their idealization, that precious, necessary, irreplaceable mirror of the grandiose self. At precisely the same moment, the backup withdraws their availability. Secondary sources, exposed by the collapse of the central narrative to the reality of what they were participating in, begin their own quiet recalibration. The social ecosystem that was maintained through the careful management of information and that depended, for its continued function, on the separateness of its components, begins to reorganize itself around the truth that the separateness was always concealing and the narcissist, who organized their entire existence around never having to face the internal void without external scaffolding, finds the scaffolding removed from every direction simultaneously. This is what the psychological literature on narcissistic collapse describes, not merely as a dramatic external event, but as a specific internal experience for which the narcissistic psychology has developed no coping mechanisms. Because coping mechanisms for aloneness require the prior development of what Winnicott called the capacity to be alone, that paradoxical developmental achievement acquired in the presence of a reliably available caregiver, of being able to exist contentedly within oneself without requiring the constant presence of an external other. It is acquired specifically through the experience of having one's aloneness witnessed and tolerated by someone who does not abandon you for being temporarily self-sufficient. That experience, for most people with significant narcissistic organization, was never adequately provided, and so the capacity was never adequately built. Torah, that the relational architecture was constructed to prevent, is, in the moment of its arrival, experienced not as ordinary timeliness, but as something closer to annihilation, as the threatened dissolution of a self that was never stable enough to exist without constant external confirmation of its own reality. Gabor Maté speaks about how every compulsive behavior contains within it the seeds of its own eventual failure, not because the universe is punitive, but because any solution that addresses the symptom rather than the wound always, eventually, encounters the limit of what symptom management can sustain. The narcissist's relational compulsion was never a solution to the underlying wound. It was a management strategy for the wound's most intolerable expressions. And management strategies, however sophisticated, however elaborately maintained, always eventually meet the moment when the wound they were managing breaks through the management entirely. That moment, the moment both supplies withdraw simultaneously, the ecosystem collapses, and the void arrives with the full, unmediated force of a lifetime of avoidance. Finally ending is not punishment delivered from outside. It is the architecture itself, perfect and pitiless logic of its own design, finally delivering to its builder the one experience it was constructed to prevent, and discovering, in that delivery, that every wall built against aloneness was always, from the very beginning, a wall built against the self.